A warm welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to talk to Dr. Anne Remmel. And I had the pleasure and honor of meeting her in Toronto about her book. She's written and published a book called Two Worlds Within, a memoir of dual identity. And as someone who has grappled with dual identity, having been born in Bangladesh and then coming to Canada and being completely socialized in Canada, I really read her book voraciously and could really relate to all her experience. So if you're grappling with dual identity, multiple identity issues, this may be the podcast for you. So let me welcome in Anne. Anne, welcome.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Great. So let me just dive in. By the way, that painting behind you is very, very beautiful, I have to say.
Well, it's mine from a long time ago. I continue to paint regularly and show, and that's a very early one, but it happens to do well on this wall.
You're multi-talented, multi-dimensional, and really excited to talk about your book. So, my first question to you is what inspired you to write the book in the first place?
Well, the inspiration really grew over a period of time as I was doing family history. And also as I was pulling together some of that history that I had collected, it seemed to me that there was a theme that was emerging, and that emerging theme really was about my life as somebody who was born in Canada, but was immersed in my culture of origin and my parents' culture, which is Estonian. And as I looked at the history, my own personal history, as well as the history of the country of Estonia, I thought there was a story here that is a universal story of dealing with two cultures at the same time.
Wow, that's really interesting that you were actually born in Canada and you would look typically Canadian, unlike myself. And at that time, of course, with immigration and so on, there are more people that look like me today than when I came to Canada. But and yet you still had some of these challenges. I find that fascinating.
Well, it depends very much on the family that you grow up in. And in my case, my parents had decided that we would only speak Estonian at home. So when I went to kindergarten, I didn't speak more than two words of English. They had coached me to be able to say please and thank you. But other than that, I had only read stories in Estonian, heard music in Estonian. That was the language of our house, and that was the language of all the activities that I participated in. So I was in a total immersion situation when I entered the English world, and that was kindergarten.
Mhm, mhm. And can you tell me some things, some aspects of Estonian culture that most people don't really know?
Well, I think people relate most to food and music as ways of understanding a culture. And in the music tradition, for example, over 100 years, Estonians gather every 5 years to have a choral festival, which entails 30,000 people singing together. So that music tradition is very powerful. And of course the food tradition too is now one could describe it as Northern European, so that it isn't as distinct as some cultures, but certainly when I went to school and I had liver sausage sandwiches that nobody wanted to have anything to do with, that was part of the culture that I was growing up in.
Mhm, mhm. So tell me, what were some of the key challenges that you faced with straddling the two cultural identities, the Estonian and the Canadian?
Well, I think the first challenge, of course, was language. Not only that I was only speaking Estonian at home and English at school. So the initial challenge, which I don't even remember as a child quickly acquiring English, there was no such thing as English as a second language classes at that time. So that my experience was that I had to very quickly adapt to another language. But the other challenges are more subtle, are more about what one does in public or doesn't do in public, or how one behaves. There were a lot of expectations that have to do with being a proper little Estonian girl. And even something as simple as, do you eat food in public? I remember being thrilled when I saw people eating hot dogs on the street, and I was told in our culture we would never do that. You would be properly seated at a table. Now, a lot of that has changed. That's also a, a feature of the time. But there were lots of signals that my parents gave, which was, this is the way we do it as Estonians. And it was different from my Canadian experience.
Mhm, mhm. I can relate to the hot dog issue because we weren't allowed to eat hot dogs because they might contain pork. So that was the issue for us. But anyway, I was wondering, as you were growing up and dealing with the language issues, did you feel, what was your psychological landscape at that moment, if you could go back to your childhood? Did you feel different?
I didn't feel that the different was something that was a bad thing. I had been taught to be very proud of my culture. And so I felt in some ways that I had a special power.
Mhm,
I had this other language. I had this whole other group to relate to. Now, it was a difficult time because Estonia was still part of the Soviet Union. It had been annexed by Russia. And so the mystery of where my parents came from was just that. It was like I am part of this tribe, but this tribe is in a place that I can't travel to. I'm part of a tribe that's ancient, that goes back centuries, but it's in a bad place right now. So my psychological state, if you will, was pride mixed with some sadness
mhm,
that I was part of this and part of an immigrant population. So that my parents had fled first to Sweden and then to Canada, and that I was part of this displaced peoples
mm,
um, society. And
mhm,
while we celebrated and while I was proud of that heritage, it was tinged with this sadness and this fantasy that, oh, if only I could see this magical paradise, which
mhm,
I eventually did. And that then strengthened my identity further.
mhm, mhm. And so, I mean, they talk about historic trauma. I don't know if because of the fleeing to Canada and so on, if you recognize that there was that element that was somewhat negative, that you speak of.
Well, I was certainly aware of my parents talking about what had happened with the part of the family that was still behind the Iron Curtain, that we couldn't visit.
Mm.
All the trauma that had happened during the war was kind of a backdrop. It was still there, and I think it's there for a lot of people, even if you haven't experienced it directly, you keep hearing the stories. And so that was part of my growing up was actually wanting to immerse myself in Canadian culture to get away from those stories of trauma in the past.
Not interesting. Wow. Wow. So, okay, so you were born in Canada and then you were growing up in Canada. Did you have the opportunity to travel to Estonia?
I did. I was able to do that in my 20s. And as I write in the book, it was a very strange experience because it was during the Soviet era where I didn't know at the time that the hotel rooms were all bugged. I didn't know that,
Wow.
in fact, our belongings were searched while we were there. There's a lot that I didn't know to expect. And also I wasn't aware of how careful my relatives had to be uh,
Mhm.
because they were aware that they were being watched and that it was a dangerous place in many ways. But I was a naive 20-year-old going and thinking, well, I'm just going to have a good time as a tourist.
Right.
It was wonderful to see the places that my parents had talked about and to meet the relatives, but it was all in the context of an occupied country with a lot of foreign soldiers around. And so I was glad to be back in Canada when that was over. Now, years
Right.
later, I went when the country was independent, and that was a very different experience. But that sort of reinforced the sadness that I felt that the country that I identified with was a place that at that point in time was oppressed.
Mm. And so it was quite a culture shock, I would imagine, because you might have had one idea of what it might be, and yet it's completely different when you get there.
Well, absolutely. And the initial culture shock of having seen the country when it was oppressed and when it was in Soviet hands was very different than now when it's it's thriving. It's one of the most digitized economies in the world. And you see all the stores that we see here. So the culture shock then had a lot to do with that period of history.
Mhm.
When I went back later, there are still differences, even in the Estonian that I speak here. And the evolving language, because language, of course, continues to grow and develop, the
Right.
evolving language means that my Estonian sounds like it's 30 years ago, like something that, my grandmother would have spoken,
Right.
where now there is a modern Estonian and with a lot of business language involved in it as well. And so the culture shock now is different because it is the new Estonia
Mhm.
compared to what I initially encountered.
Mhm. Mhm. It's interesting you talk about, the language evolving and so on. Did you have an accent in Estonian? Because I have a Canadian accent, if you will, in my mother tongue, Bengali. Did you have that accent where they could tell you were from somewhere else?
Yes. Yes, apparently I do. Now, if I visited with relatives for a couple of weeks, then I think that accent decreases. But they can certainly tell, and even the speed of speech is different. So I've been in a position where I've had to give speeches, and even if I try to, moderate how I'm pronouncing words, there's still an accent there.
Mhm, mhm. So when did you think that you were able to integrate the two pieces, that you weren't living with one foot in one boat and another, in another boat?
Well, I think the integration started early. I think for me, the school experience, I enjoyed school. I enjoyed my Canadian friends. I was a very active, both in high school and in university. So the feeling of integration was that I can have my feet in two places and not have to even think about it. It was a very unconscious process that I could blend in perfectly well in all my Canadian activities. Go on to do a doctorate at university, study hard, work in interesting jobs. And so the issue of being Estonian was a non-issue. What was harder for me was to retain my Estonian identity. And that's because with family circumstances and just being surrounded by English, that to retain that second identity was the issue for me. And it was something I wanted to do, but I had to work at that consciously to not lose it.
Mhm, mhm. And you mentioned that just in our chatting, your parents passed away in your 20s, was it?
That's right. That's right. And so I was a late arrival in their lives, and so when they passed and a lot of my immediate family members passed, I found myself in a situation where I wasn't speaking Estonian maybe once a month. I was no longer involved in Estonian activities, and so I had to very consciously return to that. And the art we talked about was one of the ways I returned. That I started organizing and showing my art and showing up and working with other artists in the Estonian community, and that was really my route back because I didn't have immediate family around who I could speak Estonian with.
Wow. Yeah, that must have been a very challenging time on many fronts, because, I think we get a lot of our identity, cultural, ancestral identity from our parents. And then when they're no longer there, you have to find ways to keep connected to your roots.
Well, exactly. And I think what was fortunate for me was that in the Estonian diaspora from Estonia, there were over 10,000 Estonians in the Toronto area. And there were so many organizations. So there were churches and cultural groups and scouts and guides and children's camps. And so there were, in fact, organizations that I could relate to and that I could be involved in as I have been quite consciously to retain my cultural roots.
Mhm.
When family isn't there, you have to find alternatives, and that's what I ended up doing.
Okay. And I was just wondering, as you were growing up, did you ever feel excluded or misunderstood in any way, just because you have that additional um, cultural heritage?
I think I was fortunate. I grew up in an area of Toronto where there were lots of other immigrant children. If I think about my public school experience for some would be familiar with the High Park area, it had lots of European immigrants, and so we were all in the same boat in our classes. It was maybe a little bit more challenging when we moved to an area of the city that was predominantly Anglo-Saxon. And then I never felt excluded. I always made friends fairly easily. I had a great experience in high school. But I also knew that I wasn't part of some of the things that people around me were part of. So my parents would never have joined the social clubs that were the Canadian social clubs. They
Mhm.
were involved in an Estonian church. My classmates might have been going to a local church. So, but I didn't feel excluded. It was more that I had this separate world and yet, in spite of that, I had a great social life. I had great friends at school, and so I was fortunate. I know that that isn't true for others of my generation. I know it's a reality for many people, and you pointed out that I visibly fit in.
Mhm.
So that if you look like the dominant group, it's easier to fit in.
Absolutely.
I was also very thankful that my parents hadn't given me a name that somehow stuck out. There are Estonian words that just don't translate very well, or names that don't translate very well into English, or they sound peculiar. So I was fortunate in that regard that I didn't have those challenges. But
Right.
again, that's my experience, and I know it's very different for others.
And I can relate to that as well because I actually felt that it was an asset to have the dual identity instead of a liability. So, I mean, that was my experience, and I know it's not the experience for most people. But, I came in the 60s where there were very few people like myself. And so we were very welcomed to Canada. I know that changed in the 70s, though. But yeah, but you touched on schooling, and you went and did your undergrad, and then a master's and a PhD. What was the PhD in?
So that was in an area of organizational development, and particularly, I was interested in leadership.
Wow.
So my doctorate dealt with trust and leadership and organizational change. And if we look at what's happening in the world now, that whole question of what do high trust leaders do and what destroys trust and all of those kinds of issues, they happen in organizations when you're in the process of merging or in the process of changing direction. But it's part of this what happens in the whole world. And so I was fortunate that I was able to work in an area that had huge implications for many places where I worked with leaders subsequent to that. And that continues to be a big theme in society, as we know.
Yes, and I think we have another podcast to do with you on just that whole topic because I'm fascinated by that topic as well. Um, I wanted to stay on topic and ask you, how has having the dual identity, how has it increased your empathy for other cultures?
I think it's had a huge impact, and I'm just showing the book right now that the book itself deals with my Estonian identity.
Mhm.
But I'm very aware that what I experienced internally and also what I experienced in my adolescence is a common experience for anybody who is coming from a different culture, whose family is trying to retain that culture, who's
Oh,
giving messages about you must stay true to your roots.
yes.
Um, those are the struggles that I describe, but they're common and there are lessons to be learned there. And I think for families, especially, that you can do both. You can both assimilate and at the same time retain what is important. And one thing I'd like to say also is that in Canada we have an official policy of multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And that's a very different approach than some countries have, where children are forbidden from speaking in their language of origin. Names are changed so that they are more, locally acceptable. So I think the context in which I grew up was favorable to allowing me to keep the two cultures. And that's not true everywhere.
That is true. And how has having this dual identity helped you with your understanding of the world? If
Well, I think it gives you from the get-go a perception that there are different languages, there are different countries, that the world is more complex than if you grew up in one society with a fairly narrow view of the world. So that I immediately knew as a child that there were other countries and countries I might mention that weren't taught in school. So if I think about the exposure that I had to European countries, I mean, we didn't study that in history or in geography.
Mhm.
I'm still hard pressed to identify some places in the world because it just never showed up in curriculum.
Right.
So I had this whole access to both history and geography, and an appreciation that the world was more complex because I also went to something that was an Estonian night school. So this wasn't just informal. This was that once a week I was going to a night school that was taught in another language, and that opened my eyes up to more than what I was hearing in my regular school.
Mhm, mhm. Do you have any key messages for anybody grappling with their um, identity issues, cultural identity issues, um, that you might be able to, share from your experience?
Sure. I think what I would share first and foremost is that it is okay to have a heritage and to celebrate it. That is not something that you have to deny in order to be a good citizen in the new country.
Mhm.
And that the balancing act of having your foot in one culture and another just makes your life richer. It also helps you to understand that differences aren't a bad thing, that differences enrich our society, and the more we can accept that, both in ourselves, that it's okay to have more than one culture, the more we are able to also empathize, I think, and understand the world around us.
Well, I think that's a fascinating, trip through your book. I would urge everybody to pick up this book if you are grappling with these issues, because I found I had to read through it within a few days because it really spoke to me and some of my struggles as well. So, um, I think your key messages are a complete wrap up of this episode. And I would urge everybody go and pick up this book. It's on Amazon and share this episode with your friends, your loved ones, anyone that you know that might be having some issues of this sort. And don't forget to comment on some of your experience. We'd be very interested to learn more about other people's experiences, good or bad. Yeah, so share as much as you want with us. So thank you very much, Anne, for honoring us with your presence and to talk about your book. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I really appreciate it. Okay, so take care.
You too.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone, for watching. And don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe.